A couple of years ago, my wife and I decided that we need to have some sort of an island in our kitchen. We have a peninsula, but it's not a really great area for preparing food. The lighting is pretty bad, and so we really want something that's more in the central center of the kitchen. And so we've got a good amount of space there. It's still not quite big enough for a full island, a full cabinet island, but we can put something there that's got a little bit of storage and gives us a space. The top that we have currently is 30 by 36, which is a really good size for us. And it fits in the space. It gives us plenty of clearance all the way around it. And so it's something that we really want to redo. I built this prototype of it out of just some materials that I had lying around, including some Baltic birch and some other plywood that I had, as well as some scraps for legs. We've been using it for a couple of years. It was never intended to be used for that long, but I just haven't had time to really get to it. With COVID-19 quarantine in the middle of effect right now, we decided that this would be a really good time for me to build this project. I put together a SketchUp plan that gives you an idea of what exactly that we're looking for, and I will be distributing that as well.
Here we have the SketchUp model that I put together for this project. I think this woman in here just give an idea of the size and the scale of this project. Before undertaking such a project as this, it's a good idea to get your ideas out on paper or some sort of CAD program. My CAD tool of choice is SketchUp. It's available on the web for free, and it's a really great tool. Major design consideration was a flat top griddle that we recently purchased that fits on top of the stove and pretty much covers the whole top. It's made by a company called SteelMade USA, and we're pretty happy with it. It's pretty nice. The kit we got comes with a cutting board on it, and it looks really nice when it's sitting on the stove and it's got the cutting board on it, and that's fine. We can keep it like that for a lot of times. However, when we're not using it and we want to use the stove regularly, we didn't really have a good place to put it. So I really wanted to be able to design this around this so I have a place to put it. So let's take a look at this grill top. It's around 20 by 27. And until we have the kitchen island, essentially what we've been doing is just kind of putting it on the floor, leaning up against a cabinet. My kids would keep stubbing their toes on it, and if I got too close to it, I'd sometimes get grease on my clothing. So it was less than an ideal situation. So we decided, since we're building this kitchen island, we may as well build around this constraint. Originally, we were just going to put 4 legs and a top on it, which would have been a pretty simple build. But we've noticed that we've been storing stuff under it, and it's less than attractive, so I decided to put a cabinet in it. I want to make the cabinet as attractive as possible, so I used some mitered raised panel doors for it. The whole project is pretty much made out of maple. The only species that's different is we do have some walnut that goes on these stripes on the top. And the top is an end grain cutting board, so it's about 4 inches thick on the outside perimeter and it's about 2 inches thick on the inside. So if we open up the doors, we can get a good look at the inside. It's got a lot of space in that cabinet. The top shelves can be really good for storing things like baking pans and small bowls. The bottom is a really good place to put appliances. So as you can see, we have room for the cutting board as well as the griddle. Now let's take another look. It's one door closed. This gives us a good idea of what it looks like when the cabinet is closed. I designed it with 3 sets of legs because I needed something to support the back part of the cabinet, and if it wasn't a full leg that went all the way down to the floor, I thought it would look a little strange. Also, I made the legs a little bit smaller to really make those end legs stand out more. I added the web frame shelves because I thought it made the project look a little bit more interesting. One of the boards I had some mineral streaking on it, and I used that for these, and it gave it a little bit more character. I could have just used a piece of plywood, but I just didn't think it would look right and it would look good, and I thought this gave it a little bit more of an interesting design. Overall, my wife and I are pretty happy with how it turned out. And so that's my design in the cabinet, and this is what we're going to be building. We're looking at all 6 of the legs here in the SketchUp model. Now, obviously there are 12 legs here, and the reason for that is that I wanted to have an extra set of legs so I could turn them 90 degrees so we could look at the different measurements on either side, especially on these middle legs. Now, you may notice that these legs are quite intricate with a lot of joinery that's going to need to be cut precisely. Moreover, there are some issues with the design that I discovered that actually have been remedied in the latest version of the SketchUp model. And as you'll notice, the legs have a series of grooves as well as some dados and a bunch of notches. I'm going to interrupt the video here for a second to just explain the difference between grooves and dados. So a groove is a channel that's cut into the wood that goes with the grain, whereas a dado is very similar. It is a channel within the wood, however, it goes cross grain. As far as notches go, that's just basically where I cut into the wood where something fits. So in the example of these legs over here, it is the areas, these notches that I cut out in order to put the wood in there, so the shelves in there, so it'll be supported. We will now return to our regular scheduled programming. And those are to accommodate the joinery for attaching things like the shelves, the web frame shelves, as well as the plywood shelves. Now, some consideration should also be paid to accommodating the precise dimensions of the components that are being attached. For example, the nominal size of the plywood was 3/4 of an inch, but in reality, like all plywood, mine was not exactly 3/4 of an inch, but rather more like 11/16. Therefore, the grooves and some of the dados in the legs will need to be narrower than 3/4 of an inch, just to ensure that there will be a nice tight fit for those pieces of plywood. However, in legs 5 and 6, up here, there are some grooves for the face frames right here that will actually be 3/4 of an inch thick, and that was a mistake that I made, was that I did not account for that, and I wound up using the same dado stack setting for doing these as well as these dados down here, which connect to the web frame shelves. Actually, it was okay for this one, but the one for the web frame shelves, it actually didn't work very well. So because I'd used that, it was a mistake that I had to really do some correction on later on. Before we can get to work on the joinery of the legs, though, we'll first need to examine the lumber to see which pieces look the best and should be on the outside of the leg. Rough cut the lumber down, mill the lumber, and laminate the pieces to come up with 4 legs that are 3 inches by 3 inches, and the 2 middle legs, which are 1 3/4 inches by 2 inches. Finally, I'd like to note that I did not actually think ahead enough with respect to the tenons, and so what I wound up doing is I wound up cutting them before. I wound up cutting them right after the legs were done and before I had the top ready, which was a mistake because their location was predicated upon the idea that the top would be constructed perfectly, and nothing ever, when you're having a glue up that's as complex as that and how we're integrating the mortises, it's never going to be perfect. It's just not going to happen. It's much easier to build the mortises into the top the way I'm doing, but then cut the tenons to size later. As it is, now that I have these tenons, what I'm going to have to wind up doing is I'm probably going to have to trim a little bit here and glue on some pieces there just to make sure that I have a good fit. Even if I did think ahead, I still probably would have cut them first, and the reason being that I knew the top was going to take a little while, so I wanted to be able to retrofit the old torsion box on there, so I did have to cut something. I'm not upset that I did it. It just means it's a little bit of extra work to get that fit right once I get the top done. One other thing I'd like to add about the tenons here is you may notice that they're offset. And the reason they're offset in such a weird location is that I wanted to make sure that I size them and taking into consideration the fact that this face frame groove right here is much deeper than the one that I'm using for the plywood for the sides to go in here. And the reason for that was I wanted to bury about 3/4 of an inch, which is the material's 1.5 inches wide, and so I just wanted to make sure there was a nice tight connection there, a nice fit. So I made sure that I sized the tenons appropriately. I didn't want the grooves running through the tenon. I wanted the tenons to be nice and have anything that would prevent it from fitting tightly.
Here's the 8/4 board that I got from Woodcraft for this project, at least for the legs. It's not enough to do the top, but I'll get that probably somewhere else since Woodcraft's supply was extremely limited. But one thing that's interesting about this board is that it's got a pretty bad cup to it. In the center, it drops down about 1/4 of an inch. So while ordinarily I would get a board and I would joint the face and then one of the edges and then rip it down on the table saw for the legs, for the final dimension, I'm not going to do that with this one because I don't want to lose all this material on the sides. I want to make sure that I maintain as much thickness as possible.
I'm going to pause here for a second because what I want to do is I want to explain what I mean by jointing and planing this board. Here we have a board that's very similar to mine. When you look at it from the top, it looks pretty good. It looks straight, it looks square. Let's take a look at it from the side and see what it looks like. Okay, from this angle too, it looks pretty straight, it looks pretty square. But if we take a look at it from the front, we can see that this is just like my board, where there's a cup to it. If we take a straight edge, we can see that it drops down probably about 1/4 of an inch, which is very similar to the situation I'm faced with here. If I were to joint it, I'd have to take off a lot of material to get to the bottom of that cup. This line demonstrates about how much I'd have to take off. After joining this board and cutting off all that material, I'd have a really nice flat reference surface, but then I'd have to take care of that crown, and I'd run through the planer for that. This next line represents how much I'd have to take off once it goes through the planer. Now, as you can see, that's a lot of material. That's probably about 1/2 inch, and I just can't afford to lose that much thickness. Not if I want to make these 3-inch legs.
So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to rip it down on the bandsaw and get the 3 legs out of each of these sections, and then I'm going to joint and plane the pieces after that.
So what I'm trying to say here is that since I don't need a board with this much width, I can cut this down into the 3 different pieces that I need, and it'd look like this. Now, as you can see, that middle piece is already pretty square at this point. And when we put a straight edge on it, we see if we were to push that one board up, it would be pretty flat against the bottom of that straight edge. Now let's take a look at those boards if we were to have them separated out, and then rotate the end pieces so that they'd be flat against the straight edge. Like this, you can see there's not a lot of material that needs to be removed from any of those pieces. Taking a closer look at this board, we can see we'd probably have to remove a little bit from the left, a little bit from the right, and some from the bottom, but for the most part, we wouldn't have to waste very much material to get this thing square. As we already said with the center one, it's looking pretty good and pretty square at this point. Maybe a little off the top, bottom, and the sides, but for the most part, we're preserving quite a lot of material. Now this third piece looks a little like a trapezoid. We'd have to take a little bit more from the left and the right, but for the most part, the top and the bottom look pretty good.
Mark this down. So this is also, I'm going to cut this at 32 right here, and then basically got the 3 different pieces for the leg here. And there's just enough for me to cut 32 off of here, and then it leaves like 34 over here. So there's plenty of room to get another 3 pieces of the legs out on this side as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cross cut it first with my Festool track saw. It's just the easiest thing for me to use rather than putting it on the table saw, and I don't have a decent miter saw.
Now, the reason I'm cross-cutting this and therefore making the board shorter is it's going to make it a lot easier to go over the bandsaw that way. And since I only need 32 inches of length, I may as well just cut it in half before I rip it down and then do all the jointing and planing. For some reason, I was having a little difficulty with this board, and the board was binding up on the saw, so I couldn't actually get all the way through. So at this point, I just kind of gave up on the track saw, take it off, well, unplug it first, take it off, and go and grab a handsaw and then just cut it. And there we go, now we have 2 separate pieces. We can then rip down on the bandsaw. Unfortunately and regrettably, I did not get footage of me cutting it down on the bandsaw, but here I am starting to joint the pieces. Before I can glue the legs up, I have to surface at least 2 of the adjacent faces on each piece so I can get a nice, tight, and gap-free glue joint. When the grain is oriented properly and the pieces have similar grain patterns, the glue line becomes almost unnoticeable. I want to be careful not to take too much material off though, because after the glue up, I will need to joint at least one outside face using the already surfaced adjacent side against the fence to ensure a 90-degree angle. Then I'll need to plane the additional 2 rough edges. After that, and only after that, I can plane it down to final dimension.
So now I'm actually going to laminate these boards together, put them together so I get the full thickness. Now, one thing that's really important when I put these things together is I've got to pay attention to that grain orientation again, because this is going to go, once this is basically turned into one piece, it's going to have to go into the jointer, into the planer, and it's going to need to be jointed as well. So we just want to make sure that when you're doing it, that the grain's in a similar position, so that way you're not, half of it's not going one direction and the other half's going the other direction, because that's going to basically cause a lot of tear out. So just something to be aware of. Let's take a look at some of these. Again, we're trying to match up. I'm trying to match up the length as well as the overall width. Yeah, unfortunately, I put this together. The grain is running the right direction, but I think there might be a board that will match this one a little bit better. Now, unfortunately, the widths that I cut these are not even close to even on a lot of them, just because the way I cut it, I wound up just making 2 cuts in it, and I put them at, I think, about 3 1/4, and the boards were wider than 9 3/4. Essentially, the last cut was always wider than the other ones, and even this one doesn't really match up. It actually is not too bad, but it doesn't totally match up also because of the other problems with cutting it on a bandsaw. I'm probably going to put this one with this one and this one with this one, and then of course 2 of these together to make that. This one's actually lining up fairly well. The grain is fairly straight on these. The only difference is this is about 1/4 inch. This one's about 1/4 inch higher. Again, not the end of the world, because I want to do it like that. Because obviously I'm going to wind up having to take a lot of material off of this anyway. What I'll probably wind up doing is I will probably take a quick pass, before I start taking it to the joiner, I'll probably take a quick pass over the table saw to just try to even that up a little bit once this is, glued together as one piece. And I think these pieces may have been, I think these are from the same board. I think there's probably a board, and one of the other ones is in the middle. But I think this is the same board. The grain's lined up really well. As you can see right here. Now that actually lines up fairly well. I don't know if you can see what that looks like. So see, that looks like that's actually going to line up fairly well. Not perfect, obviously, but well enough so that the grain should be going in the same direction once this thing's together. Now I'm going to actually try to line up the cathedrals as much as I can, based on the length here, just because of the direction of this. This looks pretty good right here. See, this is pretty much lining up over here and over here. Obviously over here there's not really as much cathedral patterning, but it does switch back over at some point. But I think this is going to be fine. I don't need to be too overly concerned about this. I can always hit it with a hand plane and card scraper if I get a little bit of tear out. I don't think the tear out's going to be substantial. And even if it is, I can probably hide whatever side that there is on that. I can probably hide that in the inside, and nobody's going to see it anyway. So now I'm going to put some cabinet maker's triangles on these just to get them lined up well. Probably good to get this on a reference surface together. So obviously I put this on there so we know exactly where to line them up, and these go together.
It's time to glue up the laminations for the front and the rear legs. You need a fair amount of glue, but it's easy to use too much. Too much glue can be a bit of a problem because it can act as a lubricant when you clamp the workpieces up and make it slip out of alignment. Not enough glue and the piece will almost assuredly have gaps, and you run the risk of delamination later on. I apply the glue on the piece and then use the edge of a piece of scrap plywood or a serrated glue spreader to spread a thin, consistent layer where there are no areas of wood exposed with no glue. You should have sufficient glue so that when you're cranking down the clamps that you have a consistent amount of squeeze out. Ideally, it will come out of a bunch of rather small droplets that do not fall off immediately, and they show up when the clamps are pretty tight but not all the way tightened. Often, new woodworkers will have to experiment to get a feel of how much glue is needed.
So I don't know if you can see that, but it's got a pretty nice thin film of glue on there.
As I put the clamps on, I initially just tighten them enough just to hold the piece in place. In this case, when I have 3 parallel clamps in place and loosely tightened, I check for alignment and make any necessary corrections to ensure that the pieces on that end are flush on at least one side.
Tighten this one on the end here. I'm going to try to make sure that it's aligned and flush on the bottom here.
I tighten down that clamp a little more, but not all the way, to hold the 2 pieces flush together.
We also don't want to tighten it too much because we want to be able to tighten it over here. And then, so you want to be able to tighten it over here, and then you want to be able to pivot and move a little bit over there so that it lines up better.
I'll move to the other end and align that side to ensure that it is flush on that end and tighten down the clamp a little, but again, not all of the way. I move to the center clamp and check for alignment there. If the 2 pieces are straight, they should be aligned and flush in the middle too. I'll also be looking at the squeeze out to make sure that it's uniform and there's enough of it. If there's not squeeze out on an area, that could be indicative of a glue-starved joint.
Now, I'm starting to get a little bit worried because there's not a lot of squeeze out, which could mean that it's a little bit glue-starved.
Which, if severe enough, may necessitate unclamping and adding more glue, but that's really only a worst-case scenario.
But as I'm tightening it up, actually I am starting to see squeeze out. It's just I couldn't see it because this is higher over here, so there's a bit of a lip. So I'm actually seeing some decent squeeze out now.
After I'm satisfied that it's been aligned properly, I start tightening down the clamps. I start at the middle clamp and then move to the outside clamps. I go around the piece, typically clamping from the middle out. I just keep going around the piece, ensuring alignment and good clamping pressure. Sometimes it's necessary to loosen and retighten some clamps. Usually, I'm looking to have some form of clamp every few inches to ensure a tight, gap-free glue joint. It's an orchestration of clamping, checking, clamping some more, etc. until I'm satisfied that everything is in alignment and looking good. I'll also start to add some additional clamps between the main parallel clamps to ensure that there's adequate clamping pressure along the entire lamination.
Speaking of squeeze out, it's been long enough that the glue has actually started to skin over here. As you can see, it's skinned over. So now is a good time to hit it with something to try to scrape it off, because obviously the harder it gets, to take off. And when it gets hard like that to take off, then there's it can be murder on your tools. If I were to try to take this to the jointer and joint this afterwards, it would tear up the blades.
After the leg laminations have been in the clamps for a few hours, the glue has had a chance to dry, and now what I'm ready to do is move on to the next step, which is to cut these boards down closer to the final dimension. The reason being is I don't want to spend a whole bunch of time and effort running these through the planer and joiner to get them down to that level. However, I want to make sure that when I do cut them, I don't cut them too much, because I want to make sure I leave it oversized, probably about 1/8 of an inch all the way around, so that way I have plenty of material to remove to make sure I can make those nice and square, and still make sure that they're 3 inches wide as well as 3 inches thick.
So now that my legs are cut down closer to the final dimension, I can start jointing them. So I'm going to look at the grain orientation. I'm probably going to take the side that was jointed on each individual board before I laminated them together, because that's probably going to be the flattest. And I'm going to use the bed for reference. The bed is nice and long and wide, so it makes a really good reference surface for that first cut. Now this first cut is most likely, since it was already pretty flat to begin with, this probably only needs about one pass. I think I'm taking about a 30-second off, and I doubt that they were really off by any more than that. So I'll mark it that okay, I've done this side, everything's good, and now I'll use that freshly flattened side against the fence rather than against the bed. And what that's going to do is going to give me a nice 90-degree angle, and so I know that when I put that through the planer on either side, it's going to give me nice flat parallel surfaces. I'm going to make sure that it's going with the grain to prevent tear out, and it's probably going to take me several passes on some of these they're not nearly as flat, but one of the things I want to make sure that I also do too is I want to keep an eye on how many passes I take, because if I take a bunch of passes on one side, I want to take the same amount on the other side, at least on the sides that are parallel with the seam of the two boards as they're joined together. Because if you take a lot on one side and not enough on the other, what's going to happen is you're going to have one side that's thick and one side that's thin once you get to that 3-inch thickness, and it's just going to look a little weird, especially if that seam is a little bit more visible due to grain direction. After this leg, I'm going to move on to the other 3 legs using the same process, getting that 90-degree angle, and then I'm going to move on to planing it, where I'm going to make the opposite ends parallel with the first ends that I flattened. Also, I'm going to bring it down to the final dimension. So with planing, I'm going to look at all 4 of the legs and see which is the widest, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the planer just slightly below that, and I'm going to run all 4 boards through that way. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to run it through one way, and then I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees and run it through the other way. And I'm just going to keep doing that process as I then raise it up a little bit, raise it up a little bit, raise it up a little bit, until I get to about 3 inches. And of course, when I get to 3 inches, that's when I stop. But again, I'm taking a look at which sides I'm taking it, because I don't want to take too much off of one side, especially when it comes to that side that has the seam in the middle of it. I want to make sure that I'm even on either side and not lopsided. And I'm always paying attention to that grain orientation, making sure that I'm pushing it through the right way. Coming up on the next episode of the Black Shirt Workshop. So the first thing I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to actually set the depth of the cut. And right now, again, it's set to 3/8 of an inch because that's what I cut into these. On episode number 2 of the Black Shirt Workshop, we'll finish up on the front and back legs by cutting them down to size and working on their joinery. Then we'll start making, shaping, and cutting joinery on the middle legs. Finally, we'll answer that age-old woodworking question, where did I put my combination square? If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to hit the like button. If you'd like to see more of me hacking my way through a project, please remember to hit subscribe and hit the alert notification to be notified of new videos. Thank you for watching.